Hi, it is me, Steve. Welcome to another episode of the Geo-Files. Today I'm going to talk about geologic map symbols. I'm going to show you how to recognize them. I'm also going to go over topographic map symbols because otherwise I don't think this episode is going to be long enough. So I'm doing this because I already showed you how to read a geologic map. I'm going to show you the detailed symbols that are in a geologic map and explain them to you, and at least the most common ones, and then I am going to actually make one for you. So anyway, I think we should start. Okay, first I'm going to start with topo maps. Ezra's being a little needy today, so you're probably going to hear and see him in the background, so I apologize for him in advance. This is a 7.5 minute quadrangle. I've talked about these before. I'm not going to go over the legend in these or anything because I've covered that before. But what I am going to do, since we do use these almost always as our base maps, I'm going to explain to you what all these colors and lines mean. This is the 1963 Bourbonnais 7.5 minute quadrangle topo map by the USGS. And the reason why I'm using this one is because these were the printed ones. Now, like I've said before, you can get them online for free, and you can even turn layers off. Like you could turn this green off, or these lines off, or this purple off, or this reddish off. You could turn all that off if you don't need it. But on these old maps, you can't. The old maps also had that system I touched on very briefly instead of wasn't going to get any deeper into it when I was doing the reading of geologic maps, and that's township and range coordinate system. We're going to start with that. I'm not going to explain to you how that works in detail. I'm just going to show you that on maps before about 2010 you will see these, but after you don't. You'll see these red numbers here. You got a where's the 33? Anyway, you got a 34, 35, and 36, and you'll see these red lines here, and where the red line is not a perfect section, it'll butt up against the roads. But these are about 1 square mile. They're supposed to be 1 square mile, and in an area like this, they likely are. It's an old coordinate system. If you look and you see these sections, you'll notice that on at least maps in where township and range is commonly used, you'll see a lot of roads follow these lines. And if you've ever been driving on these flat areas in Illinois or Indiana or even southern Wisconsin, and you may have noticed that a lot of these side streets are spaced exactly 1 mile apart. That's because they're section lines. They're running along section lines. All right, that's all I'm going to say about township and range and sections. But you notice here, hopefully you can notice, actually I will bring the camera up so you can. You notice these kind of dark reddish brown lines. Some are thick, some are thin. That's your contour interval. All right, that's what gives this two-dimensional map its three-dimensional property. All right, and down on the bottom, it'll sit there and say what your contour interval is. In this case, it's 5 feet. And 99.9999% of the time, that datum is going to be mean sea level. All right, so you'll see these thicker lines, like this says 650, so that's 650 feet above mean sea level. And then you'll see 675, but you've got all these thinner lines in between. Those are your 5 foot. So this is from 650, 655, 660, 665, 670, 675. They don't number all of them. Matter of fact, the darker ones are just there to show you that that's actually a 25-foot interval between the two darker lines, but it's still a 5-foot interval map because every line in between every space is 5 feet in contours. And sometimes you'll see dashed lines, those colors. I don't think there's any on here. Those are called supplemental. Those are used usually if you, like, we have a 5-foot contour interval here, so we're not going to have, probably not going to have any supplemental ones. But say you had a 20-foot contour interval and you were in a river like this and it gets really flat really fast. Well, in order to show like some of the topography, you'll have supplemental ones and they'll be dashed and they might be 10-foot or 5-foot intervals, but it'll tell you that down there. All right, we're going to start with what I hope is obvious to everyone. We are going to start with what this blue is. Well, it's labeled the Kankakee River. So blue on a topo map, usually a light blue like this, will be a what we call semi-permanent to permanent water body. It'll be a river that flows all year round, or a stream. It'll be a lake that's there all year round. It'll be that light blue. I've talked before about intermittent streams. They are also light blue, but unlike the bigger ones, they are this dashed dotted pattern. That tells you it does not flow all year round. That's intermittent. Kankakee River flows all year round. Been there, done a lot of work over there. It's a pretty big river. And everything on here is to scale. You have to remember that. Nothing is exaggerated, nothing's squashed, nothing's pulled. If you look at a aerial photograph of this area, it should match up exactly with what you see here. Okay? Now, roads are generally these, if they're a paved road, they're these double gray lines that run down, unless it's a more used road like a U.S. or state route. I don't think there's an interstate on here. No, there's not. But here you have Illinois 102. See, it's labeled with a red circle that tells you it's a state route and a number in it. And it goes here. This is 113. You have sometimes on the older ones, like anything that's been, like, even though this is a 1963 map, it's photo revised, and it'll say this in purple, photo revised 1973. That means anything in purple has been added between 1963 and 1973 in this case. So you have this area became developed. You probably barely see it, but there's a dashed dotted line here that says pipeline on it. That was added. I'm going to pull this up a little bit because I don't think you can see it. Okay, now a long time ago, in the 1920s and 30s when they started making these, they would do individual buildings, and that's what these little black squares are. Those are individual buildings that they were added, in this case, between 1963 and 73. They'll be purple, all right? But as America expanded, developed, population increased, building increased, they started doing stuff like this so they wouldn't have to do every single little building. And buildings don't last forever. I mean, we've been making topo maps now at this scale for about 100 years, and the ones that show up in the 1920s maps, I guarantee you, are probably no longer on here. They aren't viable buildings anymore. So a well-built up area will be this pinkish color. And like here it has the town, Bourbonnais, Bradley. So that's what that color is. You'll also have next to the neighboring topo map, in this case it's Bradley, Bonfield, and West Kankakee, and here's your scale and your north arrow. I'm trying to see if there's anything else I'm leaving out on the topo map. You have some unique symbols that don't appear in every map. Like here you have a gravel pit, and it says gravel pit, but it's got it has 2 cross shovels, and quarries will have 2 pickaxes, and they're in black. So those don't appear on every map. Man-made, like here you see these purple blobs. These are actually man-made lakes. They, like I said, anything between 1963 and 1973 is going to be in that purple color. Let's see, do we have anything else? big landmarks they'll name. This is the Limestone School. So, I mean, this area isn't very built up as compared to other areas of the U.S. I mean, Bourbonnais is a big, big town, but it's not. But you go between there, and then you have Kankakee River State Park, and you'll see the borders here. State Park BDY boundary, and it's a black dashed line. So, oh yeah, and townships. I said township and range, but when people think of townships, usually they think of the township they live in, and those are also on here. Is Limestone Township, Bourbonnais Township, Rockville's up here, folded part. So I think that covers topo maps. I apologize to you having to watch me re-roll these maps, but since the cats are being crazy, I don't want to leave them laying out and getting destroyed. My trusty 2-inch PVC with the cat that you've seen before. Alright, now let's talk about geologic map symbols. I'm not going to show you a geologic map because I've done that before. What I am going to do is take the board and draw some symbols and explain them to you. Oh, just so you know, when I went grocery shopping today, I did pick up new markers. So we're going to talk about geologic map symbols. Spelled right, isn't it? Yeah, sure, why not? Alright, we're going to talk about geologic map symbols. Now, I've mentioned this one before, but I'm going to show you it again because it's so important, strike and dip. You see, and like I said, you know, this could be oriented any different number of ways depending on what your actual strike and dip is. These are just 3 different strike and dip orientations. You've seen it before, but I just want to show you again because it's so important. Very key part to geologic map making. So you'll see that. You'll see, like I've mentioned this before, you'll see in between geologic units of different colors, you'll see a black line. It's usually the thinnest line on the map. That's your contact. That's where your 2 geologic units meet. Like say this is, we'll just say it's Pennsylvanian, Carbondale Formation, Pennsylvanian Tradewater Formation. I just butchered that. So you'll have your 2 different colors here, and then they're separated by this black line. So that's a contact that is also that's on every geologic map. You won't see one without it, okay? If a contact isn't directly observable at the surface, but we strongly suspect, like say we have, you know, like River Valley coming through here with quaternary alluvial deposits, and we have a contact here and a contact here, we'll just use the PC, PA again, or PT again. But we're not doing a surficial map, we're doing a bedrock map. And we have our strike and dips, and everything goes nicely this way. I'm not going to put numbers on them. It's safe to assume that it follows that pattern under the river. And that dashed line right here is a concealed or covered contact, or an unsure contact, this part right here, that dashed line. And it'll be the same thickness as your contact line is. We try to avoid using these as much as we can. You don't want a geologic map that's all these, because it's just like, okay, so why'd you do this then? One more thing about contacts is the scale of your map. That's why the 7.5 minute quadrangle is so good, because your contact line on that map, that means within your contact here, that's where the contact on the ground is actually going to be. And depending on what scale you use, that line can be 10 foot wide, as in the case it usually is with a 10 to 24,000 map, or 10 to 20 feet wide. Or if you're using a big map, like that one right there, each one of those contacts, it could be about a 1/4 mile in diameter. So that means, or a 1/4 mile width. So that means anywhere within that 1/4 mile you can expect to find your contact. That's why we like to use large scale maps as opposed to small scale maps. Small scale maps are just for general use. The colors I'm using up here, just quick note, are the colors that are usually universally accepted on a geologic map for that map symbol. Like black will be for strike and dip, black will be for contact. But there are other colors, and there actually is a USGS standard for what to use. I'm not going to go into that. I do have a copy of it somewhere, but I'm just going to go over the most common ones. That's why I'm doing this. So we'll get into red ones. Red is another common color you'll see on a geologic map. You'll see, a lot of times you'll see something like this, or something like this. This is an anticline, this is a syncline. What this line is it follows the axis of your anticline. This will be the axis of your anticline, or the highest point of your anticline. This will follow the axis of the syncline, or the lowest point of your syncline. The arrows tell you, they're leading a way that tells you your anticline slopes off like this from that axis. The syncline, the arrows come together, so that tells you it goes like this towards the axis. If your anticline or syncline is closed, which is really common throughout the lower Midwest, you can either leave them like this, or you can just add arrows like this indicating that they're closed on the tails. Almost no one does that, but that technically is the proper way to do it. Now, if your anticline or syncline has, like we'll use the anticline, there's the axis, here's my high point, I'm going off, but it also plunges into your map. That direction is indicated here. Same thing with a syncline, you can have a plunging syncline as well. And like with contacts, unsure axes or covered axes for anticlines and synclines will be dashed, but they will still have the arrows on them undashed. Wrong way. Like that. And if they plunge, then they'll still have the arrow. Like that. Made that a little better. Like that. Now this doesn't mean every anticline looks like this or every syncline looks like that. The axes, I mean, you can vary. I mean, ideally they're nice if they're straight, but you know, they can curve, they can do this. What they cannot do is they cannot close in on themselves. You cannot have an anticline axis that goes like this. Because that means you've got a ridge, then it goes down, then it comes back up, it goes back up, and goes back down. Now if you have 4 close anticlines like that, you're not going to complete the circle. You're going to leave it open to show that they need to come out. And they likely will. That's never going to happen. You know, they more than likely you'll have something like this, and then you'll actually have like a syncline in between the two. Now you only need to put anticlines and synclines, these symbols on your geologic map, if they're applicable to the scale you're working. If you're doing a 1 to 24,000 scale geologic map and your beds are pretty much all horizontal, I mean, there's no point in putting an anticline symbol if the dip goes from horizontal to 3 degrees back to horizontal. It's just not, it's not needed. It's just typical bedrock variation. If you do have an anticline, like you can have an anticline that, say, it's pointed, that's your high point, and then all the sides go down like that. We call that a dome. It doesn't look like that on the map. We don't use that symbol. I just did that to illustrate that if that's your highest point and it comes down. And if you were to do structural contours, they would be like this. Okay, so that's what it would look like. I'm going to erase that so you get that out of your head. But a dome symbol would be, depending on the shape of the dome, you just do this, which is kind of like vertical cliffs on a contour map, except it's a dome. Your teeth point outwards on a dome. You don't need to draw arrows for every little one. It's understood. Now your dome. Now, what's the difference between a dome and a closed syncline? Well, I mean, if your dome is being mapped like this, do you really need to do all that? Make it look like a hairy pickle or cucumber? No, you don't. You're better off, and it's simpler and less busy just to do this, because that tells you it's closed and it's an anticline. Closed synclines are called basins, and if they're small enough, they'll be on a map, and teeth marks will be pointing in towards the basin. The same general thing applies as to elongated basins and syncline as it does with the anticline, so I'm not going to go into that. I should have mentioned this when I was doing strike and dip, but I got into the anticline syncline thing and kind of lost my train of thought. We all know that, that's strike and dip by now. Arbitrary number, 7 degrees. But we've also talked about, well, what do we do if that bed is vertical? You just do that. What if it's horizontal, flat line, perfectly flat line? Well, you can't do this. You can't, because if it's flat line, like that would be 0 degrees. If it's flat to the center of the earth, you can't orient it any direction. So the symbol we came up with, and it's black, there's nothing in the middle of it. When you see this cross, the circle around it, that's not a very good circle. That's your horizontal bed. Your strike and dip for horizontal bed. That's your vertical one. Now we're going to talk about faults. Faults on a map, geologic map, will always be, or mostly be, the thickest black line on the map. Now, a fault is, by definition, a break in the earth. It's the plane along the break where movement has occurred. You don't have movement, you don't have a fault, you have a fracture or a joint. Now, ideally, that plane would be nice if it was an actual flat plane. On your map looking down, it's just going to be represented as a line, but most faults are not linear. They'll go something like this or something, kind of like a contact will. They're not linear, and we often oversimplify them. Like say in reality on your map, if you really wanted to, and you started measuring strike and dips along a fault, you realize that there's multiple faults within the fault, so it actually is a fault zone. But say this is like 10 feet, and you start mapping, and you try to map every single one of these, and you start coming up with this stuff, and it starts going like this, and the ground, you get one that curves. I'm not going to draw the other associated symbols yet, because it's for illustration purposes. If this fault zone is only 10 feet wide and you're drawing a map on a 1 to 24,000 scale, there's no need to do this. Thick black line. Alright? A fault on a geologic map will not just be a big, thick black line. There's more to it than that, because like I said, movement has occurred. You need to illustrate whether that movement has been vertical or largely horizontal. Almost all faults have a horizontal and vertical component, but one will dominate. Most of the faults out here in Illinois and stuff like that are normal faults. They're high angle normal faults. So there's a couple ways you could do that on a geologic map. You can do this and you'll have your geologic units over here. And on one side you can do a U for up thrown and D for down thrown. These are relative movements. If I had another fault further off, like over here, I'm gonna have a D here and a U here because, because logically this side would also be relative to this side. This is relative movement to the surrounding rocks. It's not an absolute movement. There's other ways to do this too. You can take the time to put on your down thrown side a bunch of hatch marks like this, and a lot of people do that. Like that. These little guys should be bigger, but you can do it that way too. If you have a high angle fault, remember this is all looking at map view. If you have, or a low angled reverse fault, and I'll get into faults in another time. I actually have done geo-rants on this and stuff. Now say your units go like this. Here's your fault. And then it would go like this. Here, this would be your up thrown, this would be your down thrown. These half arrows are standard symbols. I'm going to get into them later. That's just to show you how that would happen. But that's how it would look in cross section. On your map view, what we do for thrust faults or low angle reverse faults, thick black line like standard fault, then we put a bunch of little triangular triangles, which we call teeth, up here on the up thrown side. They point, the teeth point to the up thrown side. So this would be your up thrown, this would be your down thrown. That's just how we do it, except we don't write the U and the D. We just do that with the teeth marks. Well, what if you have a strike slip fault where lateral movement dominates over vertical movement? Still, thick black line. But now the units, instead of moving up or down relative to one another, they're moving laterally. The rocks are moving laterally against one another. So relative to one another, like you would with the U and the D, the half arrow I showed you that you use for the cross section, you use the same thing for the map. So relatively, you have this, the fault, you have the geology going this way, this on this side, this way on this side. So you had this movement. We have right lateral, left lateral strike slip faults. Not going to get into that right now. But that's what the symbol looks like. Closely related to faults are what we have. We have shear zones. Shear zones are areas where the fault suture, where the fault occurred. Faults happen during brittle deformation. The rock breaks instead of bends. But shear zones are different. They're a type of fault technically. But they are so altered through metamorphic events, through mountain building events, that their borders can be hard to find. They're a combination of something that was originally likely brittle movement that later became ductile movement. Now, they tend to be wider on a map. You can put the U's and D's, like I said before, and the relative arrows. Most people don't. The symbol is generally written as black. I've seen it as red too. But your shear zone, there's different ways I've seen it. Like if this is the edge of your shear zone or suspected edge of your shear zone, people will do this in between it. And they'll make this a different unit. They'll just say highly deformed or something like that if it's significantly mappable. If it's barely mappable, like you're doing a smaller scale map but you got a large shear zone, a lot of times is you'll just see something like this. You'll see the fault symbol and you might see like this along it. You do see a lot of those as you go into Wisconsin, UP, and Ontario. There's a lot of shear zones up there. Okay, since I do have some time here, I did dig out those books with the standard geologic map symbols on them, or that show you the standard geologic map symbols. It's in two parts. The reason why I did that is because the color printer I printed it out on only did one side, and I wanted to be able to staple them together so I could take them in the field with me. But as you can tell, this one ran out of a little bit of blue. This one's better, the second part, first part, second part. I'm going to just expose you to this briefly. It is digital, it's for digital maps making, so there will be color standards in here that use certain numbers as opposed to the color wheel scale, you know, like your 5YRs, if you've ever seen that, those aren't used. Also, certain symbols for certain geologic periods, it'll tell you how to type it in so that it'll look like some of like the Pennsylvanian, as you saw in there, is a P it's a P with another line in it. Obviously that key is not on the keyboard. When I make my geologic maps, I go in to manually draw it, but there are programs where you don't need to do that. So this will sit there and also you'll see stuff like P, key, shift, something like that, and that tells you that it'll bring that up. But it does cover, actually the part 2 is the crappy colored one. The first part's the correct colored one. Okay, so here's the cover. This is available free online. So that's just the cover that they use. And after a lot of talking about it, mainly for people who don't know how to use geologic map symbols, they start getting into it. This page will have your different contact types. And I drew on the board the most common. There are tons of different types of contact, or ways you can draw contacts. You have contacts, key beds, and dikes. That's the first, when they start getting into the meat of it. And so here you'll start to see your reds are also used for key beds and dikes. And oh, hello, Blackie has joined us. But there'll be different fonts, and they tell you that, you know, what they are here. I'm just exposing you to this. Here we have your typical strike and dip, and then they start talking about other things like lineations, foliations, apparent strike and dips, and other things like that, which I'm not going to go into detail here, at least not in this episode. Faults, there's your typical fault. See the solid line. You can add a question mark if it's an unsure fault too. You use the dashed, typically if it's concealed or covered. You'll use the question mark if you suspect one's there, but you have no superficial evidence of one, or like in a drilling log or something. I try to avoid using question marks on my map whenever possible. If I'm very suspect that something's not there, I don't put it there. And 99% of the time, when you're doing a geologic map, you don't need it. It just, remember, Occam's razor. You know, you don't need to add a fault, don't do it. Especially if you can't see it or can't indirectly assert its presence. Yeah, but there's pages and pages of faults. There's special faults for quaternary faults. Here in the Midwest, we don't have any quaternary faults, not really. At least nothing that's really mappable, so we don't use it. And remember, ductile shear zone, the squiggling lines. Here they don't have them bounded by lines. I have seen them like this too, but you can bound lines if you're pretty sure where the boundaries of your shear zone is. Joints. You can measure joints. Joints and fractures, even though they don't show movement, they can be important to figuring out the geologic story of an area, especially in complex metamorphic and igneous terrains where you can't really rely on strike and dip because you have no preferred bedding. You get plutonic intrusions. Here's your folds. These would be your anticlines and synclines. See, they are also red. There's the anticline one. Here's your basic syncline one. And these other side numbers do not actually go on the map. That just tells you how far everything's spaced to make it actually technically standard. But like I said, you know, there's things that where you can deviate from the standard, like you may want to make your arrows a little bigger. or a little smaller, because otherwise you've got a strike and dip right there that's of key importance, and if you extend that arrow, you're going to plow right over it. No one will ever be able to see it. So you can deviate from it. Yep, there's Ezra. And it does get into topo map features too, by the way. Yeah, it does, Ezra, actually. Here, Blackie, guard that for me. There's actually something else I want to show you. I'm going to go back to the blackboard for a minute before I wrap this up, because I think it is important. I just thought of it now. Ezra, you going to take over for me? Blackie, leave him alone. Ezra gets the throne. Here we go, and it begins. This is what I have to put up with every day of my life. All the time. I'm going to talk about overturned beds, because as you go north more, this is a cross-sectional view here. Say I have a syncline, I'm making a cross-section, that's my ground level. And I have a syncline that comes like this, but my beds are like this. You know, that you have another thing that you'll use as a tool to make a cross section, but you won't actually put it on your cross section. It's called a turtle. It's a dot with a line like this, and what you do is you put that on your line of cross section so you could make these lines. And so your turtle shows your true dip, or your apparent dip, along your line of cross section that you're using. And in this case it would be here, and we have another thick bed over here. It would be, this one would be here. And like I said, you don't generally put these on your cross section, you just use them as a tool so you can draw the lines. But something over here, now you go to make a strike a dip measurement, these beds are overturned. It doesn't go like it doesn't go. You can't do this. Your beds don't go like this. All right. Now, how do you know your beds don't go like that? I'm only going to touch on this right now. I'll go into it deeper some other time. But you can tell, you can look for what we call younging directions. Any bed of sediment that is undeformed is going to have the oldest deposits on the bottom, the youngest on the top. It doesn't matter if the bed is 20 feet tall or 2 inches tall. Okay? So you look for what we call younging upward. And in sandstones and stuff, it's real easy. Like you can look for things like ripple marks on the surface to determine your younging direction. Like say you have, now this isn't the natural symbol, but say you have ripple marks here. All right, and you have cross beds here. You have ripple marks here, cross beds here along your plane. Now on this side, you have this a very similar thing. You have cross beds and you have your ripple marks. And say this unit is something very geologically unique to the area and stands out. Say this particular sandstone bed is actually like a deep red and and has a lot of hematite in it. The others do not, and it's very distinct. And it's the only one in the area. So obviously this is the same unit. You look for younging upward directions. Crossbeds can also be used if you know how to do it. Other things can be used, like you see stromatolites. Stromatolites always grow on the ground surface. They don't grow underground. They don't point down underground. They don't have roots. So if you see little stromatolite mounds, you know this way's up. So how do I do an overturned bed on a geologic map? Well, it's going to be the strike and dip symbol. You'll actually measure it as if it was not overturned. Okay? So you'll measure your strike and dip and say it's 25 degrees, but you know this bed is overturned. So that dip isn't 25, your beds aren't 25 this way. This isn't your top. This is your top. This is your top, where I put the squiggly lines. So you would sit there and think about it. You'd write it normally, and then you do this like this for overturned. What that is you physically measured it going this way, but when it was deposited and before it was overturned, it was dipping this way. So you just continue it up, and this is where your actual observed dip is, this here. So you get that symbol. You don't, as I said, it's common as you go north more, but it's not as common as just your standard strike and dip. But I needed to touch on that, because even I sometimes get this confused, which way is which. There's something I forgot to mention back on the topo map part. I started telling you about the colors. I did the water, I did the buildings, I did the purple. But I forgot to mention the green, probably because there wasn't a lot of it on there. Some topo maps are basically all green. Others have, like the Bourbonnais one had a very little green around the river. Well, what is the green? Well, the green is vegetation. But it's not just any vegetation. Well, how do we decide what's green on a topo map? That's a good question. No one really can answer that. There is sort of a traditional unsaid standard that people have told me several times. And that basic standard is that in order to be green on the topo map, the vegetation must be tall enough and thick enough to hide troops that are 6 feet tall. That's just what I've been told. I've been told that a couple times from a couple different people, so whether or not it has merit, it's neither here nor there, but it makes sense, because when you look, hi, Blackie, and when you look at a topo map, that's basically what it is. You won't put green, like the white on that topo map. Now that has crops in the spring and summer and fall, but it's still white because they're not yearly. It's not yearly vegetation. Most of the green on topo maps tends to actually be yearly vegetation. But that is it for today. I think Blackie needs attention, and I hope you learned something.